Well, welcome again to another week's analysis behind the news. For those of you who watch this segment regularly, you know that I try and supply a little bit of background to some of the news and situations so that you get a better sense of what's going on. Last week I talked about the Constitution and the oath to the Constitution, and I'm going to segue from that into other aspects of the Constitution. For instance, it is difficult today to obey the Constitution and obey your oath to the Constitution without going to prison. What do I mean? Well, for instance, try violating the keep your mouth shut and just walk through the line at the airports. If you mouth off to the TSA and say what they are doing every second and every minute of the working day is against the Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures without warrant and that sort of thing, it'll get you in trouble. At the minimum, you'll be delayed. You might not make your plane. If you put up a real fuss about it, you can go to jail. And it's that way in many, many aspects of obeying the Constitution. If you're in uniform and you take that oath to the Constitution, but you're told to go to war and bomb somebody and no war has been declared by the Congress, what kind of a situation is that? But there are other subtleties in regard to obeying your oath, obeying the Constitution as a citizen, that sort of thing. And we're going to talk very briefly about a couple of those things. First of all, you know that the United Nations has a great deal of control over what we do in this country. As a matter of fact, in my book, The International Merger by Foreign Entanglements, I get into a lot of these treaties and things that are forcing us away from the Constitution and destroying our independence as an American people. But there are subtleties involved in these treaties that cause us to violate the oath of office and the Constitution of the United States. For instance, most of us know that when a law is passed, those laws may be very draconian. They might even be pretty big. Now here is the printed copy of ObamaCare, for instance, the Affordable Care Act. You know it's affordable because it's so thick, right? It's a catalog. And a lot of people are still finding out what is in here. You know the famous line, we've got to pass it in order to find out what's in it. Well, a lot of people are finding out what's in it they don't like. But this is the law. But you see, most people who've been involved in politics for years understand that it's not what the law says. It's how it's implemented. It's the regulations that are brought forward by the bureaucracy that handles that law, that enforces that law. And often, the regulations outweigh in volume the law itself in the way of how it should be implemented or run, whatever. In the case of Obamacare, I don't have it with me, but I have a photograph of myself standing in a congressman's office, and I'm 6'3", and I'm standing there and I'm reaching up like this with my full height, with my hand on top of 7.5 feet of Obamacare regulations. Now you thought this was bad, but it's 7.5 feet at that moment of printed regulations of how Obamacare will be implemented. So what's really going on are in those regulations, not necessarily what's in this document. Just like the Constitution. The Constitution may say one thing, but it might be implemented completely against the original intent of our founding fathers, such as the Second Amendment, even the First Amendment in many cases, the Fourth Amendment now with unwarranted searches and seizures in being violated at will in transportation centers. At any rate, so we know that the law is one thing, and it may be good, it may be bad. But in addition to that is the bureaucracy who have issued these regulations on how it will be implemented. Now, coming to that, and around a full circle of why I brought this up. I have in my hand from the European Commission, which is the governing body of the European Union. And this is their Trade Policy Committee. And it is the regulations, if you will, or the guidelines, better put, of how to implement CETA, the Canadian-European Trade Agreement. And it's very interesting in that what may be in the agreement may not be what they've got in the document on how to police or implement or enforce that agreement. And so we've got a Bill of Rights. We've got that all it does is delineate what God gave us. In other words, government is not giving us our rights. Our rights come from God, and government is only supposed to protect those rights, to ensure that those rights are kept fairly among the people, internally or externally from outside forces. Now, in this case, here you've got this document telling the Canadians how this is going to be implemented, the CETA. And they also say they have a strong attachment to democracy and reaffirming their fundamental rights as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So what they're basically saying is that we will judge everything in regard to this treaty based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations. Well, in my book, I point out that this, in fact, I'll read you a paragraph in here that kind of spells out what this declaration does. It said, one of the most revealing of various UN documents that provide the thinking and ultimate goals of the UN is its 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Nowhere in this document appears the fact that our rights come from a creator, as it tells us in the Declaration of Independence, God, as is clearly stated in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The UN Declaration lists a great many rights that all people possess, even more than appear in the U.S. Bill of Rights. But there are a number of welfare programs presented as rights as well. In other words, it's not simply the right to free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, that kind of thing. They put in there, in this Universal Declaration, the right to certain welfare programs. It's just like saying everybody has the right to a fair wage and the government's going to ensure that you get one. At any rate, yet very few have read this UN Declaration closely and are therefore unaware of the significance of this Article 29, which states, these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the principles and purposes of the United Nations. So you see, they are sneaking into these agreements this idea that we cannot do anything that violates the principles and purposes of the United Nations. Instead of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution, we don't notice that in these treaties, in these agreements, in these pacts, in these partnerships are something more than simply trade or military alliance or what have you. We subjugate ourselves to something outside of the Constitution, outside of the Bill of Rights, and under the UN, which says basically it can control what you say and do, and it has to be under the purposes, within the purposes of and principles of the United Nations. So that's a subtlety. It's something that's going on behind the scenes that most people don't know. It's something we have to keep in mind when we go in and support these international agreements, these foreign entanglements, if you will. Again, get my book. It details this a little bit more, International Merger by Foreign Entanglements. It's something that we've got to keep in mind if we mean to protect our rights under the Constitution and be able to uphold the oath that we take to that Constitution. We don't take an oath to the United Nations. We take an oath to the U.S. Constitution. Until next week, we'll see you then.